Good morning, everyone. My name is Brent Sellers. I'm the Center Director at the Range Cattle Research and Education Center, and welcome to today's Ona Highlight. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Betsey Boughton, our guest speaker for today. She is a Director of Agroecology at Buck Island Ranch with Archbold Biological Station. And I will turn it over to you, Betsey.
Okay, thanks, Brent, and thanks for the invitation to present. Today I'm going to talk about the relationship of Florida grasshopper sparrow habitat to cattle forage at DeLuca Preserve. I want to give a shout out to my other Archbold co-authors here. And I'd also like to just say that I'm a plant person. So my part of this project was really focusing on the forage and the habitat assessments, and any sparrow questions will have to be reserved for the avian ecologists on the team. And I do see Angela Tringali in the Zoom. So this is a fun project to talk about because it's such an interesting collaboration between biologists and ranch managers and a bunch of other partners. So I just want to give a shout out to the many partners that have worked for decades to working hard for decades to save this critically endangered bird called the Florida grasshopper sparrows. And it was listed as federally endangered in 1986, and the current population is estimated at about 150 males, so very critically endangered. And the interesting part is that some of the last strongholds of this species are on our private ranch lands. That's where this project stemmed from, is the discovery that these birds were on ranch lands. And how do we first want to understand the synergies between cattle ranching and the conservation of this bird. So agriculture is one of the largest land uses in Florida, and the two primary types are ranch lands and timberlands shown in this map. These ag lands provide not only food and wood products, but they also provide many environmental services to society. And so the ranch lands shown in orange here, and the brown timberlands, and then the green are the conserved lands in Florida. These ag lands are primary sites for aquifer recharge. They hold lots of wetlands that clean water. And in addition to the conserved lands, they harbor a large range of biodiversity and wildlife. And Florida is a hotspot for biodiversity and is number 4 in the US for numbers of endangered species. So here we have this important confluence between agriculture and conservation in Florida. And these ag lands are compatible with much of the protection and the conservation. And so we're very interested in this in the case for the Florida grasshopper sparrow. So let's zoom in to the Florida's prairie region. And this is concentrated in Central and South Florida. So on these maps, I have the acres of pre-settlement Florida. And so these records indicate that the prairie region is concentrated in Central and South Florida, but there's also some remnants in North Florida and in the Panhandle. And these prairies are flat, open plains, virtually treeless, and they were historically maintained by fire and water. So when the dry season gets really dry and we're going into that transition season when the lightning starts to, when the wet season starts and the lightning strikes start, they intersect with that really dry land. And this was a highly flammable landscape, burning every 1 to 2 years, and then followed by the flooding. That's what's thought to have kept these as prairies without trees. Similar soil types to flatwoods, but they're just a little bit lower in topography. And the dry prairies I'm talking about are between flatwoods and wetlands in topography. Now, the frequency and its extent of fires and floods, so that has changed over time. And then as well as ag and urban development have led to a loss of this dry prairie habitat. And so only about 20% of the Florida's natural dry prairie remains. And this is where this is considered the optimal habitat for Florida grasshopper sparrows. And Florida grasshopper sparrows also require fire. So the optimal time is like that first year after fire, and then habitat quality with increasing time since fire. So here's a classic picture of the Florida dry prairie. It's extremely unique. It's one of the most diverse ecosystems in Florida for plants, and found nowhere else in the world. So very rare, very special, and unique to Florida. So the dominant grass species here are typically wiregrass. Then we get some other types of grasses like toothache grass, which I'll show you a picture of, blue stems and little blue stems. And then there are some small dwarf oaks and runner oaks that are scattered in the dry prairie, as well as some saw palmetto. And here's some of the other classic species. So on the left is toothache grass. And if you chew on the leaves of these species, it actually makes your mouth a little numb. So that's why it's called toothache grass. And in the middle is the pine lily. And then we have the lopsided Indian grass. So it's just a really special place and lots of interesting plants. It's like a treasure chest if you're a plant ecologist. And this is where the Florida grasshopper sparrow lives. So this is a non-migratory subspecies endemic to Florida. It's only found in South Central Florida. Early records suggested that the sparrow was abundant and widespread across the prairie region. And the decline is mainly attributed to the loss of dry prairie. But in the 2010s, Florida grasshopper sparrows were found on ranch lands and pastures. And so then the idea became that, maybe working on these ranches for the conservation of the sparrow is where we can have the most impact for the conservation of this species. So here's a map that just shows the pre-settlement versus the current dry prairie in Central Florida. So the pre-settlement is this light green hashed area, and the darker green areas are current dry prairie. And then the red shows the current locations of the Florida grasshopper sparrow populations. And one of them is on DeLuca Preserve. So our goals for this study, which started in 2023, and even before that, we had Archbold's staff and partners working to understand the grass sparrow on DeLuca Preserve. So we are really interested in the potential for conserving ranch lands as a strategy to aid in recovery of the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And that's because most of the remaining tracts of dry prairie are in conservation. So the idea is that because there's few large expanses of dry prairie, that working on cattle grazed ranch lands that are covering a large area in this region are a potential to aid in the strategy to recover these sparrow populations. And 2 of the protected populations are on ranches. And we know from some of our other work that there are other populations on working ranches. Now, because of that, to integrate these ranch lands ongoing conservation strategies, the agencies and other partners need to understand management guidelines that balance the needs of Florida grasshopper sparrows and those of the landowners and the ranch producers. We understand we have to have profitable cattle ranch production to make sure that these ranch lands persist. So that's sort of the underlying objective of this whole study, is to understand how the ranch management can benefit both Florida grasshopper sparrows and maintain economically viable cattle production. And our goal is 12 stable or increasing populations. Currently, we're at 6. So that brings us to the DeLuca Preserve. And DeLuca has been managed for cow-calf production for decades. First by the DeLuca family and now by the University of Florida through a conservation easement by Ducks Unlimited. And DeLuca is 27,000 acres in size, and it's 18,000 acres approximately are used for cattle production. And this map shows DeLuca Preserve here in brown, and the dark green areas are conservation lands already protected. The light green areas are the Florida Wildlife Corridor opportunity areas. So the corridor is a conservation strategy that we're attempting to link lands throughout the state of Florida. And so you can see that DeLuca is a critical connector and is part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. The other really special thing about DeLuca is that it has remnants of dairy. It has both improved and semi-native pastures, and it's interspersed with seasonal ponds, oak hammocks, and pine flatwoods. So it's a very beautiful place, and hopefully everyone can get a chance to go there. And it has a population of the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And it's a working cattle ranch, cow-calf operation, so it serves as a natural laboratory in a real-world working landscape to understand the ecology and the environment and how ranch management practices affect those. Okay. So pasture management at DeLuca Preserve, it has approximately 900 cow-calf units and 40 bulls, so it has a relatively low stocking rate, and it's divided into pasture units. There's not a lot of cross fencing here. It's managed by burning or mowing every 1 to 2 years, and also use of roller chopping to maintain grassland, open grassland, and remove woody vegetation. They are bordered on one side by a highway, so they have to be really careful with smoke. And so on those areas that are near the highway, they do use mowing. And this picture just shows one of their mowing strategies, which I thought was interesting, is like mowing strips and then leaving some strips unmowed. So creating that heterogeneity that's really important for a lot of different wildlife species. So in case you're not familiar, I showed you a picture of the dry prairie before. So the other 2 major pasture types at DeLuca are improved pasture on the left. Improved pasture is typically composed of a planted forage grass, primarily Bahia grass, which is Paspalum notatum, originally from South America. They do receive fertilizer occasionally, and you do see these ditch networks and improved pastures. This is actually a picture from Buck Island Ranch. So DeLuca looks a bit different, but this shows like the primary characteristics of the 2 pasture types. Semi-native pasture on the right here, it has a mixture of native and non-native grasses, and it has a little bit more woody structure in it, and it's not as heavily ditched as improved cultivated pastures. So the 3 questions that I'm going to talk about today are, can land management benefit both cattle and Florida grasshopper sparrows? So we first started out asking, how does pasture type affect Florida grasshopper sparrow habitat quality? and how does the pasture type affect cattle forage. Forage was something we cued in on as key to cattle production. That's the foundation for the cow-calf production. So knowing the growth and the nutritive value of cattle forage in these areas and how it intersects with the Florida grasshopper sparrow habitat quality was really key for us to understand. And then we asked, what is the association of the vegetation structure with the bird communities? And this is the first step in a longer term study, which I'll talk about later, which will look at management practices. So the study design initiated in 2003. Hopefully you can see on the left side is a map of DeLuca. So this is the border, and the blue areas are the semi-native pastures. The pink areas are the improved pastures, and the green areas are the dry prairie. So we selected those areas for our study, and then across overlaid on those land use types, we have 157 locations where we do point counts. And these were established by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service originally. And then a subset of the points were used for actual forage sampling. So at all the points, we do habitat and forage sampling, but at the purple points there, that's actually hand clipping forage to look at nutritive value. And I'll talk a little bit more about those methods. These point count locations were placed at least 300 meters away from each other to avoid sampling the same birds at multiple locations. So the way that these were spaced out across the landscape was in a way that we would avoid duplicate samples. So we had a big crew of avian ecologists that went out to each of those 157 point counts in April 2023, and they used standard methodology to characterize the bird community there. And then we had plant ecologists and agronomists come out to monitor habitat assessments and forage quality assessments. So at each point, we looked at 13 habitat characteristics. Excuse me. With sort of recovering from a little cold. Okay. So we looked at 13 habitat characteristics within 10 meters of a point, including bare ground, woody plants, palmetto cover, grass cover, forb cover, the presence of runways that are the birds use to go under vegetation, and looked at also the average vegetation and the presence of fire ants. And then from each point, we also looked at distance to nearest tree, tall shrub, and man-made structure. We also identified, for the forage assessments, we identified the most abundant grass species and the percent composition within a 10-meter radius of each point. And we characterized forage condition as excellent, good, fair, or poor, following NRCS methodology. And then we used an NRCS method for estimating pounds per acres based on that data collection. And then also we use satellite data to estimate a productivity index for each point. And I'll go into that a little bit later. For nutritive value, we picked 78 locations out of the 157 point counts, and we tried to make sure that the points we selected had similar soils and hydrology. And then we hand collected within a 10-meter radius around the points. We clipped palatable grasses 3 inches above the ground, and then analyzed them, sent them for an analysis at the UF Forage Evaluation Support Lab. And there we had digestibility, crude protein, and phosphorus analyzed. So just quickly going into statistical analysis, we analyzed how pasture type affects total bird richness and diversity. We also picked out indicator species such as eastern meadowlark, bobwhite, and sparrows. And we pooled observations of Bachman sparrow, Savannah sparrows, and Florida grasshopper sparrows because we only found, I think it was 7 grasshopper sparrows at our point count location, so it wasn't enough to do an analysis on them. And then for cattle forage, we used a combination of multivariate analysis called ordination, and then ANOVAs looking at the forage characteristics by pasture type. Last, we tried to combine them together, looking at how bird communities were related to vegetation structure using a multivariate analysis called redundancy analysis. Okay, so let's get into some results. First, on these graphs, I have 2 graphs here, one on species richness and one on Shannon diversity, which take count the abundance of the species. And the colors, dry prairie is red, improved pasture is blue, and semi-native is black. And one thing that we found was that there was no difference between the pasture types in avian diversity and abundance. When we looked at the indicator species that we were able to pick out, this first one on the left is the eastern meadowlark. That's the EAME here. And that was our most abundant bird that we observed through the study. And then the middle is the northern bobwhite quail, and the sparrows are on the right. And you can see a very low number of sparrows observed. One thing that we found was for meadowlarks, improved pastures had greater abundance and density of eastern meadowlarks compared to dry prairie, native prairie. But for our other species, we could not detect statistical difference between the pasture types. And then I just wanted to show a table that kind of gives a very descriptive summary of the habitat characteristics of where Florida grasshopper sparrows were found. And this is looking at bare ground, the woody plants. You can see this number here, 6.11. That means that where Florida grasshopper sparrows were found, there was only 6% cover on average of woody plants in that 10-meter area around the point count area. And the distance to nearest tree was pretty far for all these Florida grasshopper sparrow point count areas. So they really prefer high grass coverage and really low minimal woody species, and really treeless areas is where they like to be. Next, I'll move into the forage composition results, and this is called an ordination, a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination. And what it's doing is it takes every point count and compares it to each other. So the symbols on this graph that are close together have similar species composition. This ordination is only based on dominant grasses, so it's not including the whole plant communities. And this ordination revealed little overlap between dry prairie sites and other pasture types. So this yellow circle here and the orange symbols are what was identified as dry prairie. One thing that we noticed was you can see these gray symbols, that's the semi-native, the purple are improved, the yellow is something called field 1. You can see that a lot of those are grouping with the dry prairie sites. So if the land use types in the legend here were provided by the University of Florida had identified each of these pastures as this land use type. But what it shows is that sometimes within a pasture, the actual points can be more like dry prairie, even though it's in an area identified as improved pasture or semi-native pasture. And then the other thing to note is that the gray and the purple points, which were identified, they're improved in semi-native, there's a lot of overlap there. So that means they're really similar in species composition. So we used this ordination classification to help refine our land use when we used in the other analyses. So when we characterized a point as dry prairie or semi-native or improved, if some of those points grouped with dry prairie, we reclassed it to dry prairie based on this analysis. The other thing we looked at was the percent cover of Bahia grass cover among dry prairie, semi-native, and improved pastures. And dry prairie was very different, had very low cover of Bahia grass, whereas the semi-native and improved pastures had very similar amounts of Bahia grass at DeLuca. Looking at the nitrogen, this is the nitrogen in the plant tissue of the forage collected. And this graph has 3 sampling time points on it. So on the left, April 2023. In the middle is October 2023. And on the far right is April 2024. And then the red is dry prairie, blue is improved, and black is semi-native. And in all of these, we're seeing significantly lower crude protein in the dry prairie. And in some of the time points, improved had slightly higher, but it was not statistically from semi-native. And this graph shows the digestibility of the forage, and it's a measure of digestibility. So we sent plant samples to the lab, and they placed the plant sample in rumen fluid, and then after 48 hours, they look at how much is left, and that gives you a measure of digestibility. So again, we have April 2023, October 2023, and April 2024. And what we found here is that just date matters. And there was no difference between the 3 pasture types. October had significantly lower digestibility. So time of year really matters for when you sample plants, and typically peak forage quality is June, July for these pastures, and then it declines as the season progresses. We also looked at the nutritive value in relation to the Bahia grass cover, and we found positive relationships for each of these forage quality metrics. So as you have more Bahia grass cover in an area, you have more nitrogen, more phosphorus, and slightly higher digestibility in the tissue. Now, looking at forage growth, this is how much actually is growing over a season. And we estimated pounds per acre for each of the pasture types. And one thing you'll notice right away, that dry prairie has significantly lower forage production. And at DeLuca, improved and semi-native pastures have very similar forage production. And one thing again to notice here is that it's actually pretty low. For improved pastures, we typically are looking for 5,000 pounds per acre. And this methodology estimated at these improved pastures as a little below 3,000. So it just indicates that some of the improved pastures at DeLuca may be on the very like lower intense side. They're not like a really typical improved pasture found on other ranches. And then the satellite remote sensing kind of showed a similar thing. So what we did is we looked at the greenness of the vegetation, and I have this on the right side. This is just an example of, these are individual points. So D304 is one point, D305 is another. And over the season, the greenness of the vegetation peaks and then declines as the vegetation senesces. And we calculate area under the curve as a metric of productivity. And this is really a good tool to use because it's sensitive to management practices that cause greenness of vegetation or change um, the the phenology of vegetation. And this is this graph in the middle is the full growing season of February to November 2023. Red is dry, blue is improved pasture, and black is semi-native. And it showed that improved pasture was significantly greater for area under the curve compared to semi-native and dry prairie. Okay, lastly, looking at the bird community and the vegetation structure. So this is where we kind of tried to put it all together. This is an analysis, a multivariate analysis between plant habitat structure and some of the most abundant bird species at DeLuca Preserve. The color of the symbols relates to the habitat type, and the plant characteristics are arrows that point to where the attribute is most abundant. So if you look at this woody estimate, that's the woody percent cover at the bottom of the graph. That means as you go towards the bottom of the graph, those points have greater amounts of woody cover. And at the top of the graph, we have an arrow pointing to Paspalum notatum or Bahia grass, meaning that at the top of the graph, those points have greater Bahia grass cover. And you'll notice here some points with stars. Those are where Florida grasshopper sparrows were found. And then the other thing to notice is like eastern meadowlark. There's bird name codes here. So eastern meadowlark is more associated with Bahia grass dominance. And some of these other birds are kind of found in the center of the graph. So it kind of just shows that sort of overall patterns of what birds are preferring, what kind of habitat characteristics they're preferring, and Florida grasshopper sparrows preferred areas that were treeless, 100 to 300 meters from trees, and with high grass coverage. So what does it all mean for Florida grasshopper sparrows and cattle production? One thing that we came away with is that ranchlands have promise for grassland bird conservation. Both cows and grasshopper sparrows and other birds like grassland birds. So that points to an initial synergy between cattle and grassland birds. We think that the increased plant productivity and the forage value in the pastures compared to tree may increase insect abundance, and that may also be a potential benefit to grassland birds. and maintaining low woody plant cover like the cattle ranch operation strives to do, and high grass cover is beneficial for these grassland birds. The other thing that we took away from this is that improved pastures at DeLuca seem a bit on the lower quality side. So forage crude protein on average was about 57.4 grams per kilogram in dry prairie, and then it was higher, about 76 in grams per kilogram and improved in semi-native. Cattle need a minimum of 80 grams per kilogram to meet their nutritional requirements. Total digestible nutrients were less than 52%. 52% is kind of a threshold where you want to be at or above it for good forage. So one of the questions came up, what would happen to grassland birds if forage was improved at some places in DeLuca? So that's an unanswered question. We did come up with some preliminary management recommendations, and we need more work, more research, but this is what we're kind of concluding here from our first year of looking at this data, that continuation of land management practices should be continued. So DeLuca has a 1 to 2 year fire return interval using prescribed fire. Those management practices that remove trees and woody encroachment is really important for Florida grasshopper sparrow habitat. Maintain a variety of pasture types. So we found them all over, improved, semi-native, dry prairie. So keeping all of those types of pasture types is important for this grassland birds. And then what we'd like to do is link ranch management practices in a spatially explicit way to the grassland birds and the forage quality. So that's what we're hoping to do in the future. So that would require maintaining detailed information on ranch management practices and where and when they occur. We are pursuing more research. So we had the data I showed you was from 2023, and we're continued in 2024. And then in 2025, we're starting to implement different treatments to compare. And that's what this map on the top right shows, is we're going to compare what we call sort of a prevailing practice, the way things are normally done, to an aspirational practice that more geared to Florida grasshopper sparrows, that includes a deferment of grazing after fire or after mowing is implemented. So that's the cross-hashed area. And we'd like to compare how those two different treatments are affecting the bird communities as well as the habitat and the forage characteristics. Definitely should continue to monitor the DeLuca Florida grasshopper sparrow population. It does seem from some of the data from the avian ecologist that this population appears dependent on immigration. So we're very interested in if this is a source or a sink for grassland birds. And it would be interesting to pursue funding for data collection on other grassland birds, even though many of these species aren't threatened or endangered, like the eastern meadowlark. They are declining in other areas of the US, so they're kind of a species of concern, but they're very abundant on our Florida ranches. So understanding their demographic rates and their population metrics of other grassland birds and how ranch management impacts them is an area for future work. And we are using, in collaboration with University of Florida, Hance Ellington, and a bunch of others, we're implementing this management study, and also looking at grazing intensity. This map on the bottom on the right shows a heat map of grazing intensity where cows that are wearing GPS collars are tracked. And this is just 1 week of the cattle intensity, but the dark green areas are where the cattle are spending most of their time. So with this really high resolution grazing data, we can then link that to our point count and our forage data and see how that grazing intensity matches up with our ecological data. And ultimately, if what we'd like to see is maybe an incentive payments for grassland birds for ranchers, if, for example, that if the conservation of birds interferes with cattle action in any way, that the ranchers should receive incentive payments for grassland bird conservation. With that, I'd like to encourage everyone to go and check out this film called The Little Brown Bird and just learn more about how all the partners are working together to conserve the species and ranchers, the military, biologists. It's really a great little film. And I'll say many thanks to our partners and I'll take any questions. And for Zoom attendees, you can put your questions in the chat, and then I'll ask Brent if there's any questions in-house. And thank you so much for your attention today.
All right, we have 2 questions in the room.
Okay.
Jason. Jason wants to know what the total population of grasshopper sparrows is in Florida.
So to my knowledge, and maybe Angela has more up-to-date information, 150 singing males total, which means that's just the males. So there's probably females with them. So like 300 total.
Kenzie? That was way too long for me to repeat and make sense of that question. I'm going to have Tenzi reach out to you directly.
Okay. Happy to, yeah, if anyone wants to contact me to talk about this, I'd be really happy to chat. I do see a question in the chat from Paul Gray. What would be the treatments if pastures were improved for nutrition? And I would have to ask the agronomist for this, but when I talked to Brent in a meeting about DeLuca, it was like we'd probably target the existing improved pastures and probably maybe do some fertilization there. Is that your understanding, Brent?
Yeah, it is. Actually, that was going to be one of my questions for you. Would fertilizing be detrimental to the grasshopper sparrows because we'd be potentially increasing the grass sward density of stems and everything? So that's one of my questions. Would we be harming grasshopper sparrow habitat by doing that, or is there a happy medium? We don't tend to over fertilize pastures anyway, but
Yeah,
one of my questions. But then even weed control itself, there's a lot of species that's there that I'm curious about. Is it worth removing like flat top goldenrod?
right.
It's a lot of even a weed scientist can join in.
Yeah. So I'm gonna look at this. So this is like not statistically robust data, but this is where, maybe after, a few more years of data, we'll have a better understanding of how much bare ground Florida grasshopper sparrows need. This shows that there's about 3% bare ground on average where they were found. They do have forbs, 14% on average, up to 40. And so it seems like, I mean, the avian ecologist might insight into this, but it seems like there is flexibility in the habitat structures that Florida grasshopper sparrows use. And I'm not sure we know exactly what the thresholds are.
Has a
Paul,
question.
do you want to add to that? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Paul Gray from Audubon. Yeah, so I've worked with these birds for like 30 years. I originally was managing Kissimmee Prairie Sanctuary, which now is part of the state preserve. And in the 80s and 90s, Mike Delaney was the main person working on grasshoppers, and he was monitoring populations on ranches. And what he observed was that when people would improve their pastures from the native prairie, those little populations tended to wink out. And so for a long time, we had a real bad impression of improved pasture, semi-improved pasture, and thought that grasshoppers could only really be on native prairie. But over time, obviously, when we got DeLuca, suddenly there's sparrows out there, and it's not native prairie. And even when we bought the Kissimmee Prairie from Lat Maxey, there were some improved pastures that had sparrows in them. And I think one of the differentiations is, Bahia grass can be grazed as flat as a pool table. And I think in those types of pastures, the sparrows probably don't have enough cover to persist. But in these kind of in-betweener spots like you're working on, Betsey, where you have structure and the sparrow can hide from hawks and things, um, they may do fine in that just as well as they would with dry prairie because of the structure. And so my question about, the treatments for improved nutrition, I don't think growing more grass or having it grow better necessarily would be bad for sparrows. I mean, this is speculation, but it's an interesting question. And actually, the work you guys have been doing on DeLuca have helped us sparrow people think more broadly about what kind of grasslands can the birds persist in. So, sorry, that's a long opinion, but anyway, that's just kind of some perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. So you're saying that there, it's okay if we grow more grass, but structure is important and making sure that maybe there's some forbs, or areas where there's refuge that they can hide in is really important.
Yeah, that's my impression, and obviously your work can help verify that or not.
Yeah, thank you.
I think you have one more question in the chat, Betsy.
Okay, there's a question from Dakota Schaefer, and is there a habitat area threshold where grasshopper sparrows seem to be more self-sustaining, or are metapopulation is typical of their population structure? Whew, that's a question for the avian ecologist.
I could jump on this one, Betsy. This
Okay,
is
thank you.
Angela Tringali, and then Paul can correct me if I get something wrong because Paul's really the sparrow expert. Um, so I think metapopulation dynamics are really typical of the species. But right now those populations are so small, I don't think any are self-sustaining. With the like right now there is a conservation breeding program and sparrows are being released onto the landscape at Three Lakes and at Avon Park Air Force Range, and so those are the two largest populations, and they're really dependent on input from those conservation breeding facilities. We, prior to the population augmentation, like populations were being maintained, but the population of Avon Park was for sparrows. So sure, technically it was self-sustaining, but a population that's self-sustaining it for individuals is not really a functional population. So I would say like the species is a victim of very small population size, and it's just so susceptible to stochastic events like, flooding could essentially wipe out all of the breeding area when you've only got a handful of nests on a site. So I think as populations grow with the input from the captive breeding program, like we'll still see those metapopulation dynamics, but hopefully those populations are going to get to a size where they really can be self-sustaining without the need for that input. Paul, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to emphasize our ignorance on this question. We had in 2000, there were 3 populations on Avon Park, 3 lakes, and Kissimmee Prairie that were each had at least 130 or 40 singing males. And Avon Park very abruptly went from 130 down to 10 in 4 years. And then Kissimmee Prairie went downhill, then 3 Lakes was going downhill. And we don't really know exactly why that happened. We kind of suspect it could be a disease agent of some sort, but we haven't found a disease agent that could be responsible. So that it, we don't know. So we're trying to figure out, that's what the conservation breeding program is trying to do, is keep sparrows in the landscape long enough for us to figure out what's going on with them otherwise. But you know, why they're not self-sustaining on conservation lands has been a big frustration for all of us to try to understand. So, and again, you know, this research that you guys are doing with habitat structure and sparrow dynamics can help us piece together the pieces. So thanks.
Thank you.
All right,
Um,
thank you, everybody. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, I just want to give a few updates from the center real quick. If you want to join us for our next Ona Highlight, it will be on August 12th. And we're Rick Moyer, the current Florida Cattlemen's Association president, and Dusty Holly, the executive vice president for the Florida Cattlemen's Association, will be here to give us an update from Florida Cattlemen. There's a winter supplementation seminar in Clewiston, Florida at the Dunwoody Lodge. That will be on August 28th from 6 to 8 p.m. And if you haven't joined our mailing list or our website, please see those and join us so you can keep up to date and daily. But also, if you haven't joined our mailing list at ona@ifas.ufl.edu, you can join us there. Thank you all again for attending today, and thank you, Betsey, for that great information. I think it sparked a lot of interest in this room as well as online. So thank you again, Betsey, for joining us. Hope everyone has a great day.